Long story. This series of events took place about 7 years ago. I was having a smoke outside of my small duplex apartment at about 4 a.m. I worked 12s and had an odd schedule, so it wasn't unusual for me to be alone in those early morning hours when almost nobody was awake. Occasionally, I'd have a chat with my neighbor. She was probably in her early 60s, had suffered a stroke in the past. She was very sweet and didn't have anyone to vent to, so I would listen, smile, and try to be good company. She's mostly unrelated, but will come up again later. I sat there alone, smoking, square in one hand, half a blunt in the other. It was practically silent that early in the morning, which is the only reason I was able to hear some footsteps coming from the nearby alleyway. The view was obscured by some tall bushes in my neighbor's yard, but I could see a small figure approaching.
"Can I bum a smoke, bro?"
said the figure, who's finally about to turn the corner and reveal themselves. I immediately responded, "Sure, no problem." As the person comes into view, I was a bit surprised to see it was a short man. Maybe I shouldn't note these next details, but I feel I must because I feel like it adds context to the situation. If you are sensitive to the mention of race, skip forward to the next paragraph. I'm mixed white and black, and I have waist-length dreads. This guy is dark-skinned African American. I live in a small town, rural Ohio, and I am one of the very few non-white people in the area, excluding the kids from the local colleges who come from all over the world, but are rarely seen off campus or outside of the bars and whatnot, in my experience. The fellow was dressed like he was from the city or somewhere a bit fancier or more stylish and urban than what I'm used to locally. He seemed, oddly, super relieved to see me, and even more excited when he saw that I had a blunt burning. I offered to share and basically let him have the rest. We instantly hit it off, making random small talk. I have pretty serious social anxiety. I always think I sound stupid or lame when I talk, so I really just wanted to shake hands and part ways. I eventually asked him how he ended up in the alley at 4 a.m., and he had a pretty crazy excuse. Allegedly, he had come to Ohio from somewhere south. I can't remember which state he told me. I didn't care too much. According to him, they sold him the idea that rural Ohio was a wonderland of druggies, pretty much true, and he intended to come here and hustle up a small fortune. Unfortunately for him, soon after arriving to town, he went to a local bar with the two women, began flirting with other women, and the females he was with allegedly got angry and jealous. They all stormed out of the bar, got in the car, sped off, and eventually tossed him and all of his loose belongings out of the vehicle. In the short time before going to the bar, he'd also allegedly spent all of his money doing drugs instead of hustling, so he was dead broke. He also reveals that he had a history of being arrested and being shot at. He alleged that it was all based on baby mama drama and that he was the victim. I was in no position to argue, so I just listened and smiled. He told me great prison stories of defending a man, then after being released, being taught how to make meth as a favor from the defense man's brother. It all tied in with his big hustle plans. I, on the other hand, worked 12s and had a new baby, so I wasn't really about that life, anymore at least. I went through a wannabe rapper phase in the early 2000s. Before I knew it, 2 to 3 hours had passed, and he's still talking and shows no intention on moving on. I'm overly polite, so I was stuck. My now wife came out and saw what was going on. She understandably confused. She makes it awkward enough that he leaves. A few hours later, my downstairs neighbor is banging on my door. I hardly slept, so I didn't even want to answer. He tells me my friend is outside, waiting for me. So he was there and wanted to chill and chat, which a year prior I would have been fine about, and smoked him out and chilled. But I had a kid and a girlfriend and responsibilities, so it caused issues to say the least. He said he was out looking for money or a ride, trying to make calls, etc. The whole thing was shady, and I had a weird feeling about him, but he was genuinely cool towards me and treated me like he'd known me for years. I felt pretty bad for him, considering that the small town we live in can be kind of racist, suspicious, etc., and he stood out like a sore thumb, even to me, myself being among the weirdest looking, most notable person in town. Plus, I thought somehow that I was discriminating. I knew how that felt, and I wasn't going to pass it on. Plus, I knew I was his only bastion of hope. Nobody else was going to help him or let him hang around. It's a small town, there's nowhere to go, so I ignored things like, for instance, when I asked him where his stuff was. He went back to the alley and came back with a few trash bags and a big girl's purse. He said that a man saw him get kicked out and gave the bags to him. He offered the purse to me for my wife. I politely declined, but appreciated the gesture, I guess. It felt weird, but again, I was afraid I was discriminating somehow. I gave him a big luggage-type bag I had gotten as a gift years before and never used. He transferred all the stuff into the bag. I only saw a few things, like a sweatshirt. He wore the sweatshirt later that day, and it totally clashed with his style and seemed too small. I felt like it wasn't his, but I thought I was jumping to conclusions. I grabbed him some food from inside and gave him like $20 for survival and also bribed him to leave. He eventually took off in search of rides, women to stay with, money, or whatever. As night fell, it got super cold, and when I cautiously crept back out to smoke, he appeared again, like he'd been hanging around the area for a while. He looked super cold and was shivering and rubbing his hands together. At this point, I really just wanted to let him crash on the couch, but again, I had a woman and a new baby in my house, and I didn't know this dude. So I got him some blankets and Hot Pockets and snacks, and I let him crash in the garage we shared with the neighbors. Needless to say, they were surprised to find him there in the morning. This time he said he was my cousin. They didn't like it and confronted me about it. I apologized and told them the truth, excluding some important, sketchy details, because I knew they'd probably get him in trouble somehow, and I felt bad. I knew I had to work in the morning and was not going to leave him creeping around my house with my family home alone. He was a stranger, and I wasn't going to take the risk, even though I sort of blindly hoped and trusted that we respected each other. I went online and found tickets for that day and was ready to just pay for them as a good deed and drive him to the stop. When I came out and told him, he was really thankful and thanked me so much for looking out for him. At some point, it took a weird turn, and he showed me a broken-looking security camera and offered it to me, or was trying to sell it for cash. I didn't want it and doubted it worked, and knew there was no fucking way he just legally obtained that. Still, I just wanted him gone, and I didn't want to betray him or dime him out. He left on one final search for money. I gave him another 20 or some, hoping it would keep him out of trouble. Finally, after another few hours, I heard radios outside of my window. I headed downstairs before I even heard knocking. It was the cops. Luckily for me, it was a very calm, professional officer, much unlike many I've dealt with in town. He told me that my wife's bike had been stolen, and they have it. He starts to question me about the individual. I guess when they arrested him, he described me as a tall white guy with a mohawk. I'm guessing he was actually possibly looking out for me and not trying to involve me further or cover up what came next. I think he planned on returning the bike because his possessions were still in my garage. I told the officer the truth. I told him about how I met him, how he'd been around a few days, how I gave him some money, was gonna buy him a ride home because I didn't want him around when I went to work. I didn't tell them about the stories he told me, or anything about his hustle plans, the blunts, etc. I felt I was definitely going to be accused as an accomplice. I have tattoos all over, long dreads, wore hoodies and jeans every day. I thought for sure they'd assume the worst. Luckily for me, they had already spoken to my neighbor, the woman who had the stroke, and she said I was a very nice man, that I rarely had visitors, that I'm a good dad, etc. A stellar review, to be honest. The officer said I was smart not to let him inside and didn't ask much else. We got the bike back. He was on parole or something and not supposed to be out of state. All of the items in the bags were stolen from my neighbors around the corner, down the alley he appeared from. Turns out the people he robbed were into drugs and stuff, and ran into him earlier to make some deal, and he came back and stole a bunch of clothes, and allegedly panties and sex toys. I'm not sure if the panties and dildos thing was true, and I only found that info out because the person he robbed was also my coworker. So yeah, don't share cigs and blunts with randos at 4 a.m. Last night, my friend Kay sent me a picture of a group of our friends hanging out from 2 years ago today, and it reminded me of this encounter. I'm changing names for anonymity. Kay and I had just graduated school, and we were hanging out with our younger friends before they had to go back to school for another week. James was a year behind us, and Evelyn and Mike were a year behind him. It was just the 5 of us hanging out, and we had went out for supper, and were now hanging out at a local park with a playground. It was almost dark, but still light enough that you could see all the way down the street. It was muddy, so instead of sitting on the ground, my friends each sat on one of the 4 rocking horses, tethered to the wood chips. I was the outlier, and I sat across from them on the playground equipment, about 15 feet away. We fell into a moment of silence, and Mike and Evelyn pulled out their phones. I remember looking around, and I thought I heard a man's voice somewhere behind me. "Did you hear that?" I asked. All of my friends were facing me, but the playground equipment was blocking their view, so they just looked up and shrugged. A few seconds later, I heard it again. There weren't any houses for about a quarter of a mile, and I couldn't see anybody, so it was really off-putting. James told me that I was being paranoid, and it was probably nothing. We sat there in silence for about 30 more seconds, and then I heard a stick break right behind me. I spun around, and a man wearing all black was walking behind me. I laughed and told him, "Oh geez, you startled me." He didn't answer. I then realized that he wasn't walking past me. He was walking toward me. He picked up his speed. "Who are you talking to?" Mike asked. From their angle, my friends couldn't see the man. I looked back to point at the guy, but he had turned and was now sprinting across the lawn towards the street. Kay and Evelyn caught a glimpse of him before he disappeared into the darkness. "That guy was just here," I said. I got up and moved towards my friends. I wasn't quite sure what happened, but I had never felt so uneasy. Suddenly, a vehicle we hadn't seen on the street flipped its headlights on, blinding us, and slowly rolled down the street. It stopped right in front of the playground like it was staring at us. Another person wearing all black ran to the vehicle from the opposite direction and hopped in, and the vehicle sped off. We sat there for a couple of minutes, asking ourselves, WTF? And then decided to leave and go home. I have no idea what the hell that guy wanted, but I'm glad I'll never find out. Okay, this was actually a while ago, like 3 years, and I would like to say sorry if my English makes no sense. It's not my first language. I will be translating everything from Swedish, just so you guys know. Now to the story. I was taking my daily walk with my small dog. The walk took about 40 minutes, and I was 15 at the moment. I always went out at the same time, around 6 p.m., and usually it was still sunny outside at this time, but during the winter it was quite dark. I was between a school and a football field, and was, as I could see, alone with my dog. I walked with music in one ear, and suddenly, I felt like I was being watched, and I turned my head around and still saw nothing, so I just brushed it off, thinking that the dark made me paranoid. My dog stopped to do his business as soon as I got the same feeling of being watched, just stronger this time, so I once again looked around, and this time I saw a weird man, maybe around 30 to 40 years, dark hair, and dressed in all black. He stood and leaned on one of the walls of the school and just looked at me. I quickly started walking, hoping he would leave me alone. I was too scared to look back, and because of that, I just noticed how my dog started growling. He is a small dog and usually is not aggressive at all. My dog suddenly ran behind me, and stood between me and the man I saw before.
What a cute dog you have. Is he aggressive?
He said, while he was looking in my eyes and smiling. Thanks. Not usually, I answered.
A small girl like you shouldn't be outside alone in this dark.
At this point, I was almost shaking with fear, but I tried to control myself. At first, I didn't know what to answer, so I just let out a little awkward laugh.
Maybe I should walk with you. I know a wonderful way we could walk. I'm sure your dog would appreciate a longer walk, don't you think?
That's nice of you, but I can't. I need to go now. Nice to meet you. I attempted to start walking, but didn't get very far before he had grabbed my arm.
No, I insist. Come on.
This time, it was more like a demand, but he still was talking calmly. No, I can't. I need to go. I tried to make him let go of my arm, but this made him hold on harder.
No, you are coming with me. Now.
Now he seemed angry. He started to drag me with him. My dog, who moved when I started talking to the man, thinking everything was fine, came running in full speed when he heard me scream, "Let's go!" and bit the man's leg. This seemed to distract the man enough to let my arm go, and I kicked him in between his legs. And then I started running, and I did not stop until I was near my home. To be sure I wasn't followed, I hid behind a building and waited for about 10 minutes. And when I didn't see the man, I ran the rest of the way home. I did tell my parents, and we did call the police. But because no one saw anything, and the lack of security cameras at that area, they installed them 1 year later or something, they could not do much. I don't walk that way alone anymore. It confused me how quickly he became aggressive and started to drag me towards a path that goes through a small forest.